All right, welcome everybody. Welcome back everybody. So we're going to continue with Agape. And Daniel we're going to go in the same order. So Daniel is going to be the proposer. I will be the educer or the midwife. And Sandra will be the scribe.
All right. So just before we started the recording, the guy said a few things about the connection between love and beauty, and also a kind of remembering the obvious that we usually forget. Perhaps perhaps the job of the philosopher is to fall in love with this veiled but obvious reality. So I will just try to come up with a new proposal. Agape as a virtue is the continual remembering of truth, goodness, and beauty in all beings.
So Agape is a virtue. It's the continual remembering of goodness, truth, and beauty in all beings.
Yeah, I'll also write it down.
Yeah.
Is the order, you said first truth, goodness, and beauty. Does the order matter, Daniel? No.
No.
Okay.
So Agape is the continual remembering of truth, goodness, and beauty in all beings.
Yes.
Yeah. Can you say something about the continuous part? I hear the practice or the virtue in, it seems like I hear our part of it is the continuing.
Yeah. So, as you know, we tend to forget this hidden reality because we are just in being in the world. We are often, other things that become more important, and then we just forget to love.
Yeah.
We care about ourselves, or we care about our desires, or we care about, I don't know, status or other things, but not this agapic love, which is able to draw out truth, goodness, and beauty from all beings. It has this. It can help. It can help us to cultivate that eye of charity, which is able to redeem every single being and restore it to its fullness and perfection in truth, goodness, and beauty. So that's why, again, what you said, then continuing this process of remembering that behind every being, we find just behind there veiled this reality where it can be restored.
Yeah. Yeah.
That is what we usually, I think, forget.
So there's this behind, right? What I heard is that there's a reality, right, that's not apparent or obvious to our way of perceiving, right? In
Yes.
fact, our way of perceiving is a forgetfulness of this reality.
Yes.
And the remembering is the seeing and the seeing and the seeing by,
Mhm.
and in that the restoring to being the good, the true, and the beautiful that has been forgotten. And that remembering is a redeeming, a redeeming into remember, like redeeming into the good, the true, and the beautiful being beheld in this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's yeah, I don't want to say behind almost, but it is in a sense invisible. This dimension where beings showing their truth, goodness, and beauty.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then it's just the perhaps the mystery is really how this because this remembering is, I think, is very hard. So
Yeah.
continuing to do that
Yeah.
is then really how agape as a virtue enacts itself.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
last time we had this, we made the distinction between agape as a virtue and agape itself.
Yeah.
And what I have in mind is then when agape is when this love is, so to say, enacted fully, or enacted with a kind of really a kind of, I don't know, mastery, or kind of really a complete self-emptying of yourself, then this itself is then truth, goodness, and beauty. So
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
but I think remembering is this task, so we can get to this other reality in itself, as itself.
Yeah.
So remembering is this act that is virtuous, and with that we learn how to behold this other reality.
Right. Is it? It seems presupposed in remembering seems to imply in our virtue, in the virtue of remembering, seems to imply a relationship to forgetting.
Mm-hmm.
But what is this? I want to draw that out a little bit more about what is this? It seems to remember and to consciously remember seems to also be aware of forgetting,
Mm-hmm.
right? There's something mysterious there. Wondering if that evokes anything in you.
Perhaps there's a movement. You can say unforgetting, right, in English. Yeah. So it seems to me, because for me, agape has this restoring quality. So it's kind of like I give myself to other beings, so they can shine forth in their truth, goodness, and beauty. And when I do that, I also remember kind of like my own capacity of minding this reality. So there's almost like an invisible exchange that's going on. I empty myself, but that restores both beings and myself into this more original reality, this more this that is closer to the transcendentals.
So it's kind of like it's interesting because I think I'm hearing this. You make an intimate relationship here between there's something paradoxical or similar or close in this relationship between emptying and forgetting. Like there's this emptying on one level that restores myself and beings and all beings, right? And this forgetting is in its own way a kind of a loss or kind of strange emptiness in some way, right? And I'm kind of, as you're talking about this, I'm seeing this point where they converge, and something in that point seems where the turn happens or something like that.
There's something like this forgetting as self-emptying is more original than the forgetting just happens when you get absorbed by things, by the world, by the affairs, the hearsay, the news.
Oh yeah, it's almost
all of that kind of thing
in the world, right? And self-emptying is
the self-empty. Now you had it right? You just had to do this. The self-emptying starts from myself. This is also then where the virtue lies, because I have to make a concerted effort to empty myself and to love other beings. Right? This is hard. But in the other way, when we forget, we are just beings just come to us.
Totally. So there's this kind of losing myself into the absorption of the world, right? And then there's this emptying myself in bringing myself to the world and what's beyond the world. And something comes in there. This agapic love comes in that self-emptying.
Through that self-emptying, then this, let's say, truth, goodness, and beauty, that's eventually, I think, will be disclosed. And then we also, then I can, then I when I can behold that, then, then the virtue makes sense. Just then being as it is discloses itself.
Right.
Through that virtue, is that what you're saying? Being discloses itself through the virtue.
So let's revisit the proposal. It still rings.
Okay, I have it down originally. Agape as the virtue is the continual remembering of truth, goodness, beauty in all things. There were points made about remembering being redeeming.
Mhm.
Mhm.
Uh, uh, remembering is a task. Remembering is the seeing and being seen by, and in that restoring to being the good, the true, the beautiful. And you also said, with remembering, we learn how to behold, and you use the phrase with the eye of charity. Where was, yeah, that, and when I empty myself, that restores the balance between me, the me and others. And I give myself to other beings so they can shine forth. And then you got into what, if that's remembering, forgetting is implied, and what is forgetting? So there was a distinction about forgetting as self-emptying, being more original, forgetting out of just being forgetting, just being caught up in the ignorance.
Yeah. Agape is more like an original
And
forgetting. Yeah.
Original. So,
yeah, more original. Where did I see?
origin.
Yeah, so you said we forget the hidden reality and we forget to love. We care only about ourselves, but when we cultivate the eye of charity, it restores all beings. So we cultivate the eye of charity.
Yeah, the eye of charity for me is something like you know, when you say with Plato, it's like that eye that is capable of beholding that invisible reality, that reality outside of the cave. De Gennaro would call it something like ingenuous seeing. It has, and you know, this has to do with glaucon and the old eye, all-eyed. So this way of seeing that is, so it can, but really, I mean this more in a Christian sense, perhaps, because there I think it's radicalized to some extent. But for me, this eye of charity is just is seeing the form of a thing, the idols, behind the actual appearance. So
Right.
that to speak in Platonic terms.
Yeah.
So it's perhaps when we say this with the video series that John did, it's the eye of charity is the eye that is capable of educing the idols or participating in the adduction of the idols.
Yes. Daniel, what is agape?
I've again spoken too much. now I don't know how to compress this into one sentence.
I mean, I got the sense you pretty much just expanded on the original thing that you said.
Yeah, but now I don't know how to compress this.
Yeah.
I mean, I could rephrase it. Agape as a virtue is the remembering qua educing. So remembering what's this? Like a line. Yeah, that thing. What's that called in English? I've forgotten it.
Reducing.
Yeah, qua educing.
Yeah.
The dietetic dietetic form, the dietetic reality.
Yeah.
So I've rephrased it.
That's nice. Agape as a virtue is the remembering qua educing the eidetic reality.
Yeah, I'm happy with that for now.
Mhm.
Because isn't it just, I will play with one example, and then I'll shut up, and it's guys time. Like when you, for example, when you love a child, then you already in that, I think you assume that there's something like a divine eidetic personhood behind that child, and that it will steadily grow into that form. But in that loving, in that agapic loving, I already assume that that's the case, that kind of like lies behind that child.
Yeah.
And whatever it is, because it's invisible, I have no idea. But I assume that it will eventually grow into and come closer to that, let's say, eidetic reality of its own being.
Yeah. 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 Okay. I'll go into appreciation. So much to appreciate about this, but I think I'm really appreciating this, the eidetic you're talking about, right? That you brought in this kind of, that there's something about agape, right? Presupposes the seeing of that which makes something a person, right? It both sees and is seen by what the non-apparent form behind things, and thus, like the example of the child unfolds in that seeing, right? In some sense. So there's this kind of way where the seer, the one with the agapic love, is seeing and drawing out the form of the child, and sees it in the child and developing through the child. That whole, like a deduction in some sense. That this appreciating is a way that love is in some sense something like a power, right? That affords one to see it, remember it, draw it forward, hold it, drawn into it. Yeah, there's a lot there. There's a lot there. My sense is I anticipate that this line, this kind of drawing out and being drawn in the development, the co-development that happens of both the parent and the child, right? Or the scientist and the cosmos, right? Like the wherever there's the seeing, being seen development there, there's something more to be disclosed about that, right? And that's also what's mysterious to me, which I'll probably kind of take up in my turn, is this kind of, it's so interesting because agape, I think what's mysterious to me is this way that agapic love in so much is about the universal, right? Like the unconditional love, right? Like you said, Daniel, the way that the parent sees that universal child, right, in all of its stages of development, right?
I would say the eidetic reality calls forth an urgency to love unconditionally.
Yeah, totally. Yeah,
It necessitates
yeah,
the unconditional element.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And that's true because it's like, you know, I mean, it's watching my son and his mother. His mother has fallen in love deeper and deeper and deeper with the child, right? So it was this quality of like she saw something in him that induced her as well as him mutually. You can kind of see this as he becomes more formed, her amazement becomes greater, right? There's this kind of co-shaping that's going on, right, with that. So this this way that the eduction happens both ways, right? Of somehow it's beyond viewer and viewed, right? It's in some sense it's creating both somehow. And so what's mysterious to me about that, I mean, what's not mysterious to me about that, but like, is somehow this universal thing kind of produces the most particular things. Like it makes people, right? Specifically, right? But it's universal, it's unconditional in that sense. Yet it somehow produces the most personal, the most particular, right? Yet it's transcendent to all of that, but it somehow makes person. That's mysterious to me. Okay. So what actually this kind of just brings the whole a couple sessions ago back where and this image, it surprised me. I walked myself into it and it kind of hit me between the eyes of where we were talking before last time about agape and the relationship to vulnerability, right? And this kind of sense in which the kind of bringing myself into the, like say, I'm the Pope, right? And I'm loving the poor and kind of walking my way being the Pope and seeing the most desolate, right? The most vulnerable, like the most, I don't know, pathos, like, and in some sense that that fragility, that vulnerability is where he goes all the way to the point where he's like the Pope kissing their feet, right? This way that you know, there seems to be this movement, and you can, I mean, I don't know Jesus's story that well, but you know, there's tons of stuff about loving the poor, like this whole thing about loving all the people that are informed, traditionally unlovable, or something like that, or pathetic, or whatever, right? And that specifically, there's something about this agapic love that in some sense seeks the most vulnerable. Yeah. And somehow from this big love, right? That comes in and in the most vulnerable, and then the child, which is vulnerability itself, basically, gives itself to that. And then these poor become people. The child becomes person. This whole thing starts to happen, right? This universal somehow like enters in and gives itself, and then somehow person comes out. What's up with that, right? I think that's the thing that's like, what the fuck is going on with that?
Mhm, mhm, mhm.
So and also that was my experience of playing with this sense of, this kind of idea where with the Greeks, there's this erotic relationship to the good or to God or whatever, right? Whereas really
Mhm.
from here going up, and then there's the Christian notion of like God's loving us coming back. And so like there's this when I'd be out in my walks, I'd be like, and that one's less familiar to me, right? Like that orient. I'm more Greek naturally, but like, so, but I was trying to evoke the imaginal and like see if I could feel this sense of being loved like that
Yeah.
by the non-apparent, right? And it was really interesting because somehow I had to really be personal, and I had to be known in being personal. I needed to be known by the thing that was loving me. And the thing that was loving me was personal. Yet I had to hold two things in my imagination. I had to have the sense of personalness to be able to love me as a person, right? And specifically me. Yet I couldn't, I had to do it in a way that I wasn't seeing anything, any beings. It couldn't be a face. It couldn't be an image. And that was complex to kind of imagine, but I could do it. Like I could walk, I could get this sense of like, oh, I could somehow adjust my imagining as I'm walking along in some way where everything, even whatever's beyond everything, can comport itself, where there's this kind of like from all directions, guysengstock, right, is being loved, right, as I'm walking along. And there's this, there it is again, this kind of strange thing going on between person and universal, right? Like personalness and this universalness, right? Like it's got, I think the virtue must have something to do with this front of the hand, back of the hand thing. Like, and then there's also that kind of element of forgetting and remembering, right? These two ways of emptying, right? There's something about that. I'm imagining the entry point to agape as a virtue has to do with something so right at that precipice. So if I think about it, like so encircling, I think, I mean, encircling, you get, I mean, it's in some sense, it's like it's a ritual in agape, right? Like you do this, I mean, it just happens all the time. Yesterday, I was working with some of the advanced trainers, and they were circling this woman. It was just kind of like, there's this woman who had just started meditating, right? And she's describing her experience since, where she's realizing like, one, she's realizing like how frightened she's been her entire life. And she's seeing it, right? And like, so she'd start talking about it and she'd become present to the tragedy that she had spent so much of her life in anxiety, right? And she'd get into the grief of it. And so she's in the grief of it, and you just feel this grief with her. Like it's just this genuine sorrow for her own suffering. But then she kind of, in some sense, she'd go deep into the grief, and we'd go into it with her. And then she'd be like, without at all leaving the grief, right? But like something transcendent happened within the grief, where it'd be like, and she's like, then she'd say like, oh my God, but I'm so fucking grateful I could see this, right? Because there was this kind of element of like, she couldn't see it before. It just was her life. But now that she can see it, she can now grieve it. But the very grieving, although it feels painful, is the revelation that there's something that can see it. And that something that can see it twisted free from it, right? And you could see this, you could see her. I don't know what that is. You could see this human kind of going through that and emerging and seeing and recognizing herself in that whole thing. And everyone's just like, the perception of her and the experience of loving her they're the same thing, right? In some sense.
Yeah.
And in some sense, she was like, I mean, that's an example. I mean, it's just in that, and there's something about contacting the most personal in someone else, the most vulnerable in someone else. That thing that draws you into the vulnerability, right? I'm wondering if that's the ido seducing.
I find that very interesting that you said the perception of her, of the her that was not in the identification with the grief, and loving her, that once you saw her, it was impossible not to love her.
Yeah.
To that to me is just mind-boggling.
Yeah.
If we saw ourselves, if we saw each other, if we really saw each other, we could not help but be in perpetual love with each other, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Totally.
I mean, it's just, it would be impossible not to be in perpetual love with each other.
Yeah.
Yeah. And when you're talking, Guy, and I see the image behind you, and I'm thinking, we have been talking about people and seeing the idos that people represent, but that work of art, there's no way that wasn't powered by the virtue of Agape, of absolute love for that form.
Yeah.
You know? Or Mozart, or people who devoted their lives to emptied themselves to the art that needed to come through them, right? I mean, that it's sort of like, I mean, it's not just about other people, it's about all forms of truth, beauty, and good.
Yes.
Right? Yeah. All forms.
Right. Right.
Universal.
Yeah. In fact, you get that sense of just with this image, you see this light, but you don't really, you don't see the source of the light.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
You don't see the sun. You just see this effusive
Yeah.
sense of that.
Yeah.
So I want to say something like, so, okay, so this is, let's see if I can kind of bring this into, summarize this into a proposal. I propose agape as a virtue is a proactive, volunteering vulnerability. To what is most vulnerable in all forms.
Mm.
In redeeming the seen and the seer.
Agape as a virtue is a proactive and voluntary vulnerability to what is most vulnerable in all forms, I suppose. Yeah. Redeeming the seen and the seer.
That
Is that
seems
correct?
that seems like a good summary.
Yeah. Okay. So this, yeah. This vulnerability, there's implied a voluntary vulnerability and an involuntary vulnerability.
Yeah.
Yeah. Talk about that.
Yeah, because there's this quality of where, so for example, like so I'm thinking about this myself as embodying the virtue of agape. It's like I'm it's my voluntary vulnerability to what is most vulnerable, right, in beings. So in that sense, right, it's not like the beings are necessarily volunteering their vulnerability. They're showing it. They're showing it. But like, in the sense that vulnerability is like, in some sense, like what Daniel was talking about, the remembering. Remembering by making contact with what is most vulnerable in the poor and the young, right? And then that quality where I'm transformed in seeing that beauty, but then there's them being educed out, right, of that very seeing of the beauty in them. And there's that possibility for that mutual, like that thing that happened with that circle I was talking about.
I'm just writing this down. So your adoption of a stance of openness, vulnerability, is affords the coming into form what is that the realness, the unveiled of the form that you the form that you are opening to. Is that right?
Yeah, it's like that sense of like, you know, that moments where Jesus kisses the poor's feet, right? In some sense, what are you seeing when you see that? Like you're seeing something like the poor, and here's God himself, right? Coming in some sense, getting so close, or that in some sense they trade places, right?
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
this. It is a mutual
Touching,
right?
yeah, touching the lepers, going into the leper colony.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah.
That most feared of contagious disease, right?
In that kind of coming and kissing the feet, right, is this way. I think what that symbolizes and shows is that in order to love agapically, you have to get that vulnerable, right? It's an act of vulnerable, and it's a voluntary act of vulnerability on your behalf. That's self-emptying. Right?
That's the self-emptying, is the voluntary
Or
proactive.
also there's this quality
voluntary.
there's also this quality of like the difference between, you know, there is that difference between vulnerability and being exposed, right? Like I think this gets at that, you know, where it's like I can be volunteer, like I proactively reveal myself. That's vulnerability versus somebody like strips my clothes
Ripping away
in front of like the army or something, right? Like that's you know, being exposed.
Yeah, that act is in no way an act of the virtue of agape.
Yeah.
When it's stripped away, that's quite the opposite of agape. Yeah.
So there's this kind of, it's like you get to that place where it's like being like this voluntary vulnerability. It's a strength, right? You can't, at some point you can't quite tell the difference between the vulnerability and the strength, right? They come together, and there's something about that that seems essential to agapic love. When I'm kind of grokking.
And I hear in that strength a devotion to truth itself, to you know, that truth is something that you are emptying yourself into voluntarily.
Yeah.
Knowing that knowing that it's necessary. It's necessary.
Yeah. Yeah, it's right. As you're saying that, it strikes me as like, in some sense, maybe that's what I have faith in. Like what I have faith in is the truth. So there's the truth in two ways. Like there's the truth of letting yourself down all the way towards another being, right? And seeing that being in the truthness of the worthiness of that, right? Like that part. But then there's that kind of more eventfulness of truth, like that Heideggerian eventfulness of truth, which is where it's not like what I know that I then express, but it's in the expression emerges the truth, right? There's the faith in that sense of the word too, in both ways. So I think there's something about there's something there about what I have faith in. What affords me to be able to be that vulnerable is the truth. Somehow.
Yeah, and truth as an event seems important.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, not propositional truth or anything
Yeah.
near that, but truth as.
Yeah.
So that the act of enacting the virtue of agape is enacting that in a sense enacting that truth as an event.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So is there anything more you want to say about this guy?
Nope. This seems like this is a good place for you to go to appreciation. And then it's 12:30. I have to go right at 12:30 today. So
Yeah, I do. I really, this vulnerability, this focusing in on vulnerability. I mean, we can talk about self-emptying, but how does that actually, how do I actually enact that? So focusing on this vulnerability and willingness to enact truth is kind of like more hands-on for me. How I can enact that rather than say, okay, I'll empty myself. I mean, so that sort of gives it some material clout and challenge too. And what you had brought out before about once we do that and see with the eyes that enactment affords us, see with those eyes, cannot help but love. It's the same. It's all the same. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So.
Oh.
I think for me, when I brought up what an artist must feel, or a musician, like, we're all pretty much involved with people in our lives. All three of us have always been involved with people. But what an art, the kind of vulnerability an artist must enact in him or herself to bring into being that eidetic quality, that I think that would be really interesting to explore myself. Yeah.
Yay. Nice work, you guys.
I'll go to bed.
There is a when Van Gogh cut off his ear. that's perhaps hinting at the kind of
Oh yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
so that
You guys, I gotta head out.
Okay.
Much
thank
love.
you both.
Guy.
This was
Thank you,
really
Daniel.
good today.
Very good. Bye.
This was lovely.
Bye.
See you Wednesday, Dan.